Welcome all. I'm Kel Kidman. Welcome to Breaking on the Daily. Today we have a 4-week lockdown in the UK. May last even longer if it doesn't work, or according to their explanation, if COVID numbers don't fall. And I've already done a diatribe on lockdowns. I've done it plenty of times before. Go back and watch that video if you haven't already seen it. But my position on lockdowns is that they don't make logistical sense. That essentially the idea of limiting the amount of spaces one could be in order to promote social distancing is really stupid. These sort of contradictory goals seem to do nothing but get in each other's way, and my argument for lockdowns is that essentially they either go even or even they might even be detrimental to actually caseloads. But it annoys me to no end that people keep on claiming that they're going based on evidence, that they have an evidence-based approach to the pandemic spread, but then say, even if the evidence shows that our response isn't working, we're going to double down on our response. We're not going to actually reevaluate our response and see if we could do something else. And this is one of the most quintessential examples of such. Lockdown, if it's not working, if it isn't reducing the spread, shouldn't you just not do it? I mean, this is based on after 4 weeks of lockdown happening. If the numbers haven't gone down, that's plenty of time for the lockdown to actually kick in. And if the lockdown isn't working, if it's not decreasing the numbers, if it's increasing the numbers even, they're saying, yeah, we're just going to keep doing it. Because the fact of the matter is, most COVID responses, whether it be masks or lockdowns or any of these sorts of things, shutting down specific entrances into buildings, which is, by the way, the most ridiculous one, aren't really to actually solve the pandemic issue. They aren't designed to do that. They're designed, rather, to inculcate the populace with the idea that the government is taking the pandemic seriously, even if it's not working in the first place, like the response. And that seems to be what COVID has become. I mean, we have even more stories, like the fact that Fauci is talking about how we're in for a dark time in the winter, where he's praising Biden and criticizing Trump for having people like Scott Atlas on, who seems to be doing more of the anti-lockdown stuff because he has a brain. It's becoming more and more clear to me that Dr. Fauci is very, very much out for his own skin more than anything else. I've already made this point before. I mean, and this story is just another one. I mean, Trump has been signaling that he's going to fire Dr. Fauci if he wins tomorrow, which, hey, another reason to vote for Trump there. But what I really wanted to talk about was the fact that most people seem to be under the illusion that bureaucrats are somehow not only non-political, but somehow unbiased. Somehow they don't have any sort of agenda or aren't in it for anything, that they are impartial. This is untrue. This is completely ridiculous as well. Bureaucrats have as much of a political bent as any other. I would argue, in fact, that bureaucrats are substantially worse than politicians. Reason being that politicians pander to people. They pander to the voters. They pander to their constituents. Bureaucrats, however, pander to politicians. So in that line of succession, it's obvious that the politician will be more accountable to the will of the people than any bureaucrat ever would be. A bureaucrat is simply there to be out for his own skin, or in some cases to be out for the politician's skin. I mean, you have so many examples of bureaucrats going down when the politician does something messy. You see this a lot with the Obama administration and even the Trump administration. I mean, you got like Janet Napolitano, Hillary Clinton, all these sorts of people who were in the cabinet or were high-level staffers or those sorts, who went down for specific scandals, things like Fast and Furious, all those sorts of things that happened during the Obama administration that Obama continues to pretend never happened and that he only ever found out about on the news. These sorts of things just continue to go on. And on top of that, to get into more election news, we have a story from CNN, an editorial, talking about voter suppression, essentially making the argument that things like voter ID, anything that was designed to protect against voter fraud, things like purging voter rolls, is all just a ploy to get back Jim Crow laws. It's completely ridiculous. This article, which is worth reading in an archive, of course, it talks about how things like, people preventing ex-felons from voting is voter suppression. Forcing people to have driver's license is an undue burden on voting. It's just completely ridiculous. I mean, their idea of reasonable voter laws is anyone who just walks into within 100 meters of a voting booth to just be shuffled in and then given a name and a number to vote for. That's their idea of reasonable voter laws. And they talk about things like, once again, things like voter ID, and what I wanted to talk about here, the voter rolls. How, all these Republicans are purging the voter rolls. That's such a... because all of these people aren't using their voter rights. Somehow defending the efficacy of the voting rolls as they exist now, despite the fact that just a few months ago, a deceased cat got a voter registration application. And not just a cat, but a cat which has been dead for 12 years. This is just to say that government records are completely ridiculous. Also, all of them are terrible. The voter registration isn't much better. I mean, you have people who are dead who are still registered to vote, and if you have Democrat voting laws in, then anyone who could reasonably replicate their signature would be able to just walk in and then vote for someone who's dead. I mean, that is a legitimate possibility. Of course, they also claim, voter fraud isn't a thing, and no, it doesn't exist. Look at all these cases where they refuse to investigate, or they have specific laws to make it as difficult as possible to actually verify that someone voted properly. And all of this is evidence that voter fraud doesn't exist, of course. I mean, we also have all this evidence of, like, Project Veritas and all those things coming out, which, by the way, if you aren't subscribed to Veritas, or you aren't watching this stuff, it is something worth watching. There's a lot of stuff going on, and it's not just the Democrats doing it, all right? They recently found that a GOP candidate was buying votes, essentially, and the interesting thing in that case was that he was buying votes for himself and also Joe Biden, which is really weird. Like, himself and no other GOP candidate. It was strange. It was real strange. I mean, there's obviously a lot more to that story than meets the eye, and I'm interested to see where that goes. Veritas is one of the only investigative journalist outlets that still exists. I mean, and this is all coming on the back of Democrats completely doing a 180 on their voting strategy, going against sort of the mail-in ballot stuff with, for instance, Amy Klobuchar telling Minnesotans do not vote by mail. Don't vote by mail. Mostly, I would say, because the vote by mail numbers are not very good, or they aren't as good as they should be for Democrats. I mean, in certain states where they should be ahead by a whole lot in early voting, based on all the predictions, which, by the way, are what the polls are based on. For those who don't know, it seems as though the Republicans are up at this point, and it's really, really bad for it's looking worse and worse for Democrats, especially since Republicans are expected to have a surge on actual voting day on November 3rd, tomorrow, which, by the way, I will be streaming tomorrow. That's going to be fun. I'm probably not going to be streaming all night because screw that, but, whatever. On top of that, you have another story here. Maxine Waters on conservative black voters. I will never, ever forgive them for Trump vote. Because you really, really want to convince... They really seem to want to convince black voters that they think they own them. I mean, you see this more... You've been seeing this more and more. I mean, it really started with when Joe Biden said, if you don't vote for me, you aren't black. But it's been going on. You have things like, I think it was Chelsea Handler. It was the 50 Cent situation where she was saying, I own you. You can't vote for Trump. It just keeps it just keeps going on. I mean, you get a lot of this sort of stuff, and you also have a lot of these sorts of panicky nonsense mongers saying things like, you have Mary Trump, Donald Trump's niece, warns of an authoritarian state if he's reelected, which, based on his COVID response, I don't think that's an arguable point at this juncture. I mean, you have a president which, during the biggest government takeover of people's rights of the past century, not doing that. Instead, deigning for a federalist response where the states are taking control of of the actual response to COVID. It's wonderful. I mean, he is the most federalist president we've ever had. I'm sorry. It's not even close. I mean, Reagan wasn't this federalist. It's crazy. It's been a while since we've had a president this federalist. You'd have to go back to pre-1900 to get a president that was this federalist. You have so many examples of him just saying, well, let's let the states handle it. You have not only the COVID response, but you also have, say, the riot response, which a lot of people criticize, but I think not only was pragmatically useful, as in he didn't fall for the obvious trap of going in and then having people claim that he was an authoritarian, tin-pot dictator, which, by the way, would have been a fair criticism at that point. He also portrayed himself as being very federalist, which he ostensibly is. Well, no, he is at this point. It's astounding. And to be clear, federalism is pretty much the opposite of authoritarianism. It's the idea of localism. It's the idea that local powers should have the ability to control their particular interests rather than the large-ass state that we have nowadays. And we're seeing this more and more with Donald Trump. It's wonderful. It's really, really glorious. And that's another reason you should vote for Trump. I mean, I think you should be able to notice this was recorded a day before the election. I mean, a lot of this is, and we're going to be doing election into tomorrow as well. I mean, this is going to be our focus for the first half of the week. Once again, going to be live streaming tomorrow. On to our next story, though. Joe Biden's tax plans have now, according to the, let's see, which was it? And according to the Enterprise Institute, his plan has been shown to increase spending by $11 trillion over 10 years. This is completely ridiculous. I mean, because it's not federal spending total. That's how much federal spending will increase over 10 years. And really, federal spending needs to be stopped. I mean, and it's a complete departure from how Joe Biden normally operates. Because normally Joe Biden, he used to have spending sense. He used to be able to say, okay, we should freeze spending, which is to say we shouldn't increase spending, by the way. It's not that we should stop spending entirely. I wish. But it's so funny how skewed our ideas of money have gotten in this country. I mean, you have things like modern monetary theory, one of the most ridiculous modern theories on economics that has ever been proffered. I mean, second probably only to the shrinking markets fallacy in its scope and complete ridiculousness. There's so much that has just been utterly skewed. I mean, you have the example of people claiming that federal tax revenues have been decreased despite the fact that after the tax cut, despite the fact that they increased because federal spending increased by more than the tax increase was. The taxing revenue increase was. You keep getting this more and more often, where people just lie about how statistics work with regards to money. I mean, you get that a lot of the cases, in a lot of places. You get a lot of that, and it's something you need to look out for, especially with regard to monetary spending. So much of it has been infected by communist rhetoric, by socialist rhetoric. You really need to watch out for when they're using a different definition from you. I mean, there's so many examples of this. I think one of the quintessential ones being greed. I mean, greed has been fundamentally redefined. And one of my big bugaboos, by the way, with libertarians and the Ayn Randian types, is that they use the communist redefinition of greed and then say greed is good, which is silly. Because the communist redefinition of greed is essentially ambition. They essentially redefine greed to mean ambition in order to say, well, if you have any ambition, which is just a benign aspect of being human, it's a benign aspect of wanting better for yourself, then you're greedy. If you want better for yourself by self-improvement, then you're greedy, which isn't how greed works. Greed is quite actually the opposite. Greed is wanting something without putting in the work. People don't really understand this. I think it's one of the biggest follies of the libertarian movement that we continue to use the word greed using the communist redefinition, because it alienates people like Christians, which, by the way, I am one. It alienates us because, well, greed's a deadly sin. Greed's bad. Greed's a sin itself. And so it alienates a lot of people who really shouldn't be alienated by capitalism at all. You get that a lot of places, though, in libertarianism. I mean, if you look at my Twitter bio, yeah, libertarianism is not, it's not having weird moral standards. It doesn't make you a libertarian. By the same standard, having traditional moral standards doesn't make you authoritarian either. I do have traditional moral standards. I'm also a libertarian. Square that one in your heads, guys. It's not that difficult. Now, on to our last story, and this one's pretty encouraging. A new batch of polls have now come out saying, and assuming these are correct, that he'll soar past 300 electoral votes, because all of these polls are showing things like Michigan, he's up by 3 points. He's up 2.1 in North Carolina. He's up 1.3 in Pennsylvania. You're getting a lot of these right before the election. 1.1 in Wisconsin he's up by. And you're seeing this dovetails into the fact that a lot of pollsters, Nate Silver being the most obvious one, are absolutely hedging their bets. Because throughout all of this year, they've been talking about how Trump has no chance, Biden's up by 10, he's up by 12, he's up by imaginary numbers. And now, right before the election, you're saying, well, he could lose. Because, honestly, all of these people are just trying to save their credibility. Pollsters are completely ridiculous. They're completely ridiculous at this point. They're another example, like the courts, of an institution which has power derived from respect. I mean, respect, it's not... don't trounce on respect. Don't underestimate it, all right? Because respect is truly powerful. If you have respect, if you have the respect of the people, that's pretty powerful. I mean, the courts have been able to do pretty much whatever they want because they have the respect of the people. And similarly, things like the polls or things like the media have the respect of the people, or at least did up until the past 4 or so years. And that is what they have derived their power from. And so polls in the past were essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts, because so long as they weren't super far off, they would be able to manipulate enough people in order to actually change the results of the election to what they wanted. And you're getting a similar effect with things like social media, where people are trusting social media a whole lot more nowadays. But all of this sort of soft power is predicated on the idea that whatever institution you're talking about has the respect of the people that it's trying to manipulate. And pollsters don't have that anymore. I think this has been clear since 2016, but I think we're going to see it again as well. Polls don't have the respect of the people, so they can't. Not only can they not affect the actual result of the election through their self-fulfilling prophecy of people seeing the polls and then kind of wanting to adhere to the results of those polls. But you also have an example of people either being honest with the polls, which comes from a lack of respect as well. I mean, the fact that 10% of people or so lied to pollsters is evidence enough, and those are, by the way, just the people who admit it, is evidence enough that people don't respect polls as much as they used to, because before before recently, that would have been unthinkable. I mean, you tell the truth to the polls. I mean, these are respected institutions, at least they used to be. But so you see all of this kind of crashing down. And that's what happens when an institution loses its respect. And that goes the same for things like legacy media. Legacy media has absolutely lost the respect of a lot of people. And so it has lost the ability to see reality for what it is and be able to affect the reality as it is to what they want it to be. Because they've gone so out of the sort of normal expectations of what a media company is supposed to do. I mean, they're supposed to at least look like they're reasonable, which they aren't. You're seeing that a lot. And I think this election is really going to show that the American people are done respecting all of these sort of ridiculous institutions. And I think that's one of the most encouraging things for me. Because it would mean that the American people are getting more activated. They're becoming more active in politics, which is really important because I usually like to describe the political system that the American founders set up as a set of gears. And when all of these gears are running, it runs perfectly. But the problem is that a lot of these gears have stopped moving. And one of the most important set of gears that has stopped moving is the American people. But it seems as though they're starting to start moving again. They're starting to get going again. And that's really, really encouraging. And I want it to be encouraging to you. So I want to leave you with that. So, subscribe for more. This has been Breaking on the Daily. I'm Kel Kidman, and I'm out.